Thank you all for joining FSR's 2022 Global Virtual Patient Summit and for coming to this afternoon session, Steroids and Sarcoidosis, Balancing the Burden discussion. Before we get started, I do have a few quick pieces of housekeeping to review. This session will not have time for open Q&A. If you have any additional questions after the session has concluded, you can submit your inquiry to the FSR message booth and visit the Steroids chat board to keep the discussion going. With that, I would like to introduce today's speakers. Mary McGowan, FSR's Chief Executive Officer, will be guiding today's fireside chat. Mary joined the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research as the organization's first ever Chief Executive Officer in October of 2020. Mary brings 35 years of nonprofit leadership and management experience to the role. Prior to joining FSR, she served as Executive Director at the Myositis Association, where she was featured and highlighted as a preeminent rare disease leader by numerous entities, including the American Autoimmune-Related Disease Association, Global Genes, and the National Organization for Rare Diseases for her innovative national campaigns. Mary also served as CEO of Women Heart, the National Coalition for Women with Heart Disease, speaking up for the 45 million American women living with or at risk of heart disease. We also have Dr. Peter Sporn, Professor of Medicine and Pulmonologist at Northwestern University. Dr. Sporn's clinical interests include sarcoidosis, asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and interstitial lung disease. Dr. Sporn also is involved in research, and research interests include pathophysiology and treatment of sarcoidosis, innate immunity and host defense in the lung, airway inflammation, and remodeling in asthma and COPD. Finally, we are joined by Dr. Sanjay Shukla, President and Chief Executive Officer of aTyr Pharma. Dr. Shukla has extensive pharmaceutical and biotech experience and received his MD from Howard University College of Medicine and his Bachelor's of Science in Microbiology and Master of Science in Epidemiology and Biostatistics from the University of Maryland. Thank you all so much to our speakers for joining us today. Before I pass it over to Mary to get our fireside chat started, I would like to thank aTyr Pharma for their generous support for this year's summit and for sponsorship of this session. FSR is honored to partner with aTyr. Mary, I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Angela. Good afternoon and welcome to the Steroids and Sarcoidosis, Balancing the Burden Fireside Chat. During this afternoon's discussion, we will explore a topic all too familiar for those in the sarcoidosis community, steroids. Dr. Sporn, we'll start with a question for you. We know that so many people in the sarcoidosis community are prescribed steroids to help manage their sarcoidosis symptoms. We also know that so many in our community experience significant challenges associated with steroid side effects, which we hear impacts the physical, mental, and emotional health of our community. With the burden and serious side effects of steroids, why do doctors prescribe steroids to those living with sarcoidosis in the first place?
Well, Mary, thank you. And let me just say that I'm very, very happy to participate in today's session. So you asked a very, very important question. We prescribe steroids in sarcoidosis because really many, many years ago, it was shown that steroid medication is able to reduce the inflammation, the granulomatous inflammation specifically, that is at the heart of sarcoidosis. However, along with that potent anti-inflammatory effect of steroids come a variety of side effects. For many years, we didn't have other medications that were known to be effective in sarcoidosis. We still do prescribe steroids as first-line therapy because they are among the most effective anti-inflammatory medications we have for treatment of sarcoidosis. They work quickly, and as I said, they're potent in reducing the inflammation in most patients. The flip side, or the double-edged sword of steroids, is that there are many adverse effects that go along with steroids, both acutely when they are first used and then particularly chronically when they are used for a long period of time.
Thank you for that. And we understand that many patients are prescribed steroids for a very long period of time. And, so why, despite the side effects, are steroids the most widely used treatments? So as an example, why are non-steroid treatments not used first?
Well, non-steroid treatments aren't used first for a couple of reasons. One reason is that steroids by themselves may be the most effective and the only needed therapy, and it's possible to get patients off the steroid medication, prednisone being the one that we use most commonly, without the need for very, very long-term therapy. But the other reason is that the second and third line therapies, the non-steroid therapies, are either less potent and less effective, or in the case of the third line therapies, which we'll get to, very, very expensive and sometimes difficult to get for patients. So steroid medication remains the first line, but specialists who take care of sarcoidosis often will combine steroid medication with second line non-steroid medication to boost the effect of the steroids and allow for a reduction in the steroid dose. One problem is that many physicians in the community who don't see cases of sarcoidosis often, as a rare disease, most physicians don't actually have a lot of experience with sarcoidosis. So physicians who don't see many patients with sarcoidosis just aren't very familiar oftentimes with the alternative therapies, the second and the third line therapies we use to treat the disease.
Got it. And so what kind of alternatives are there for steroids exactly? And what might some of these treatment options look like for sarcoidosis patients? And the other question I have is, when should people be discussing alternative options with their healthcare providers?
Well, I think that patients with sarcoidosis should discuss all the possible treatment alternatives with their healthcare provider when the discussion of treatment first comes up. Steroids are, as I've been saying, the first line therapy for most patients. However, there are certain situations where we would want to avoid steroid therapy or only use steroids at a very low dose and rely primarily on a non-steroid medication. And an example of that would be someone with diabetes that's not well controlled, because one of the adverse effects of steroids is to make diabetes control worse. Steroids can actually, in fact, even induce a diabetic state. But in patients who have poorly controlled diabetes, as one example, we would generally try to avoid steroid medication, or if we have to use steroids, we will use the lowest possible dose and rely on an alternative medication. So the alternative medications, the second line medications, that's the group that I'll mention first. Many of people who are listening who have sarcoidosis will be familiar with these medications, or some of them, but the most commonly prescribed second line medication is a drug called methotrexate. Methotrexate is in the class of what we call an anti-metabolite. And at the doses we use to treat sarcoidosis, which are similar to the doses used to treat other diseases that involve abnormal activity of the immune system, rheumatoid arthritis being the most common example, the drug has anti-inflammatory effects. It works differently than prednisone or steroids, but it's not as potent and it doesn't work as quickly. It often takes several months for us to see the benefit of methotrexate, whereas prednisone will have its anti-inflammatory effect within days to weeks in most situations. Other medications that are in the second line category include azathioprine, mycophenolate, also known as Cellcept, and a drug called luflunomide, also known as Arava. Those are the main medications we use as second-line therapies. Like methotrexate, the others that I mentioned are generally less potent than prednisone or steroids in suppressing the inflammation of sarcoidosis, and they generally take longer to work. However, we recognize that in many circumstances, combining these second-line medications with prednisone does offer some benefit. It allows us to boost the effect of prednisone and or reduce the dose of prednisone and maintain anti-inflammatory activity. And ultimately, in those cases where these medications are effective, we often are able to get the prednisone dose down to a low and more manageable dose with the addition of one of these second-line therapies.
Great. Well, thank you for that. It's complex, right? And so for part of this, it's trial and error with these medications to do a balance to see what is most effective for each patient. Is that correct?
That is certainly correct. I would say that every patient with sarcoidosis is in some ways unique. And so there isn't a one size fits all or a single formula that we can apply to making decisions about treatment for all patients. And so to a certain extent, the treatments that we use, we guide the decision-making about those treatments based on the individual characteristics of the patient at the start of therapy, and then how they respond to the treatment along the way.
Excellent. Thank you for that. My next question is a two-part question, actually. So Dr. Sporn, the first part is for you. As you know, FSR has been working to increase industry interest in sarcoidosis with the goal to improve the quality of life of those living with sarcoidosis and working to get better therapies. Do you believe steroid-sparing agents could be the future of sarcoidosis treatment? And Dr. Strukala, from an industry's leader's perspective, how has and is your company's efforts helping to shape the future of sarcoidosis treatment?
So do you want me to go first?
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. I didn't mention third-line treatments. I should mention them here because there are third-line treatments that we commonly use. The most common of those agents is infliximab, and that has a brand name Remicade and now some newer brands of the same drug, which is a monoclonal antibody. And the other is Humira, which goes by the name adalimumab. And also there are some newer brand names of that medication coming down the pike. Those medications are effective in a number of patients. We often will use those medications when steroids are either ineffective or the side effects are not well tolerated, or when the disease is just particularly difficult to treat. Those medications, however, suffer from a number of disadvantages. The first disadvantage is that they've never been FDA approved for the treatment of sarcoidosis. We have fairly extensive experience using those medications in sarcoidosis, but they actually don't have FDA approval for treatment of the disease. And therefore, insurance companies sometimes balk at approving payment for the medications. And that brings up a second major disadvantage of these medicines, which is that they're very, very expensive. Now, if there was FDA approval for use of these medications in sarcoidosis, insurance companies would, in general, pay for the medication. And so there wouldn't be a huge cost burden to patients for using these medications. The other thing is that they're not effective in every patient. And so we really do need new therapies, and we need new therapies that are specifically tested in sarcoidosis patients using modern clinical research methods, which means a randomized double-blind clinical trial to prove both the safety and the efficacy or effectiveness of these medications in sarcoidosis specifically, so that the FDA will approve the use of these medications for treatment of sarcoidosis. Fortunately, as we're going to get to, there are new medications in the pipeline, which hopefully will be proven to be both safe and effective.
Great, thank you. And as you know, we recently held a FDA patient listening session on steroids, of course, was part of that discussion with the FDA, and FSR really highlighted the importance of ensuring that we do have more effective therapies and the urgent call for that as we speak, to make sure that those living with sarcoidosis have more effective therapies. So Dr. Sukula, from an industry leader's perspective, how has and is your company's efforts helping to shape the future of sarcoidosis treatment?
Well, thanks for inviting me on this panel, Mary. I think our approach, I think we are leading a real paradigm shift here. 5 years ago, when we embarked on this journey to move our lead candidate into sarcoidosis, we took it very seriously. We're a small company. This is not a hobby for us. A big pharmaceutical company is looking at 10, 15, 20 different types of indications. This was something that is our priority. So first and foremost, I echo what Dr. Sporn has said here. We embarked on this journey and we wanted to run rigorous, well-controlled trials, and now we are moving into obviously a late phase trial. But we thought that was the first step, was really moving into this area. I think groups have followed us, and I've always said for some time here now, even with you at the FSR, our goal was to also open the door for other companies, small companies, to say, this is an important indication that deserves a therapy that is FDA approved. And I think that takes a certain amount of courage to do that. And I certainly spent quite a bit of my time as a public company CEO educating the broader population on why we need to do better, why we have to have a better therapies. Dr. Sporn has mentioned a number of first, second, third line agents that are in the arsenal. But the key thing here is nothing's FDA approved. So there becomes, beyond evidentiary requirements, you then have to battle the insurance company sometimes. So I think the first step was really to enter the space and start to demonstrate good quality research. And we did that with our previous trial, partnering with the FSR and centers like Northwestern with Dr. Sporn. So I think the first step is here to really, get into the space and say, okay, we're going to, this is an important area for us to actually move into research. And our therapy, we thought, might have some potential, and it's thus far, turning out fairly well thus far.
Yeah, and we're very excited about that, the entire sarcoidosis community. And so as part of that, we know that patients are critical to driving research forward. And there are so many in our community that want to help continue to progress research. What can the sarcoidosis community do to help make therapies, better therapies, possible? Dr. Sukula, would you like to answer that first? And then we'll go to Dr. Sporn.
I think patients play a huge role in shaping also the clinical development. As someone that's worked for about 25 years at a number of companies, I've sometimes worked on therapies that I consider disease modifying, and other times worked on drugs that, well, maybe just sort of helped out on the edges. So I think where patients and where the sarcoidosis community has really done a good job, but can continue to do more, is highlight therapies that, for example, replace the steroid burden. This is something that was one of the key concepts of our potential therapy. We wanted to run a trial, and to my knowledge and to some of the experts' knowledge, we were one of the first to attempt to run a trial with a steroid taper protocol. So it's very aggressive, it's very ambitious, We were, as I said, probably the first company to try this in this area of lung disease. And I borrowed from some aspects of working in lupus and myasthenia, because then you can basically tease out, this is a real effect that's happening here. It's just not on top of steroids. So I think that's where patients can play a role to say, companies like aTyr, other companies, we need therapies that really modify and improve my daily quality of life. There's always the ability to improve something like forced vital capacity, and not to pick on any of the pulmonologists, or certainly Dr. Sporn here. That's very important, we know clinically, but patients can also play a large role in saying, I need this to help my symptoms, my cough, my shortness of breath, and I need it to be safer than what I'm already on. So if it's steroids, I need this to not have all the deleterious effects that steroids come with. So I think we have lived our mission. We've sort of approached this in a very, I'd say, ambitious manner, because I think at the end of the day, we want a therapy that, as I said, is disease modifying, not just sort of, something that helps out on the fringes. That's really our goal.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Sporn, I'll ask you the same question in terms of the sarcoidosis community. What can we do to help make better therapies possible and to continue to move this momentum forward into the future?
Well, certainly we need the scientists to come up with new approaches to treating the inflammation in sarcoidosis, and to develop drugs that will specifically target the pathways that drive sarcoidosis. But we also need research, clinical research and clinical trials, like the trial of the new agent that aTyr has developed, that focus not just on some of the traditional endpoints that in the past were the main focus for research on diseases like sarcoidosis. And Dr. Shukla mentioned forced vital capacity, which is a pulmonary function measurement. So we don't want to just focus on what in the past have been considered objective measures of a disease, such as a pulmonary function test result, or a change in an X-ray or CT scan, or something else, such as a blood test that we can measure. We need to focus on what's very, very important to patients. And certainly those things are important to patients, so I don't want to minimize that. But we can't ignore the symptoms of sarcoidosis, which are really what the patient has to deal with, and families of patients have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So if, for example, when we treat a patient with prednisone, a steroid medication, we suppress the inflammation and the CT scan looks better, but the patient has gained weight, the patient is having trouble sleeping, the patient suffers from more fatigue, that is not a step forward in many ways. And so what we really need are medications that are effective, that also benefit the patient in the ways that are most important to the patient, and which together add up to quality of life. So Dr. Shukla mentioned that term. But now, when we do clinical trials of new treatments in sarcoidosis, we incorporate those features into trying to figure out how well a new treatment is working. So we have a variety of ways to measure through questionnaires that are validated for this disease and other diseases like it, to actually give us a specific measurement of how a treatment is affecting a patient's quality of life, not just how it's affecting the CT scan or the pulmonary function test. And so that's very, very important. And I think we've learned from our patients, those of us who've taken care of patients with this disease for a long time, we've learned from our patients how important those particular elements are that add up to quality of life.
Exactly.
Mary, if I could
Yes.
just add one thing there too.
Please. Mhm.
It's also the responsibility of companies like ours, and I think we did this from day one, to listen to that patient voice. So part of the reason why we incorporated the elements of steroid taper, for example, in our protocol, this was done in the offices at the FSR, where we sat down with the patient community. We sat down with the experts there, and we heard this was going to be really important. So as Dr. Sporn said, it's one thing to show improvement on forced vital capacity or an image on a scan, but we also have to be able to show that quality of life improvement and not replace, not just have another problem develop because you're replacing something else. So this is something where I think patients can make their voice heard through organizations like the FSR to tell companies, this is important to me beyond just a biologic, a biomarker moving. I also need to see that this medication is also going to improve my life.
Exactly. Thank you so much for highlighting that. The patient voice should be at the center of all of this on an ongoing basis throughout the entire research and clinical trial process, and ensure that those patient voices are heard and that they are part of this ongoing research to get us to better therapies and hopefully eventually a cure for sarcoidosis. So as we wrap up, are there any last reflections on steroids that you think is important for the community to know? Dr. Sporn, we'll start with you.
Well, I would just like to emphasize what I said earlier, which is that patients with sarcoidosis should speak with their healthcare provider about all the alternative treatment approaches that might be used. And I would suggest that patients whose sarcoidosis is complicated and which requires treatment on an ongoing basis should consider at least consulting with a healthcare provider who works at a specialty sarcoidosis center. And FSR has partnered with the World Association of Sarcoidosis and other granulomatous diseases to evaluate sarcoidosis centers. And there are many now centers of excellence and other specialty centers, which I think the information about those can be accessed through the FSR website. But because it's a rare disease and because many physicians in the community are not familiar with the nuances of treatment, and until we have new treatments, such as the treatment that the medication that aTyr that is being studied, that aTyr is leading with, we have to use the medications that are available now. And so particularly to minimize the use of steroids as the mainstay of therapy, which is what physicians out in the community for the most part do, it's important for patients to speak with their healthcare provider about all the possible alternatives. And I think it would be important in many cases for patients to at least have a consultation at a sarcoidosis specialty center.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And Dr. Shukla, any last reflections that you would like the community to know about?
I would just say that as we've talked about steroids quite a bit, and we're trying to spare patients from steroids and maybe even replace them one day, it will take also participation from the patients. And we greatly appreciate that, whether it's our trial or other trials. Patients should demand that the important endpoints that they care about are in there. In this case, trying to reduce steroids. But then as we test and learn about these therapies, it's going to require the community to get involved, because this is rare disease and it's very difficult to enroll in these kind of randomized clinical trials. So for us, we partner with the FSR because we really need the help of the community to learn whether or not the drug works or not. And I'll just say this, whether the drug works or not in this last phase of this trial, we're going to learn a lot. And I think at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to learn something so that experts like Dr. Sporn can look at all this data and say, okay, how do we devise better plans or trials in the future? Nonetheless, I'm still very excited about our upcoming phase 3 trial. I am going to put a pitch out there for anyone interested. Please look us up, because we need the help from the community to get an approved therapy.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. And thank you really on behalf of all of those living with sarcoidosis for the extraordinary work that you and your team are doing. This is very exciting. And thank you so much, Dr. Sporn, for joining in on this important conversation. On behalf of all who have been impacted by sarcoidosis, we're grateful for both of you and your dedication to improving the lives of those in our community. Thank you also again to aTyr Pharma, today's session sponsor, for aTyr's commitment to developing innovative treatments for sarcoidosis and for your support of this educational summit. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
all.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you all. Thank you all for joining today's session, Steroids and Sarcoidosis, Balancing the Burden. To learn more about steroids and sarcoidosis, please visit the aTyr booth for more resources and information. Thank you again.